Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Reaktor 6 tutorial series. We're going to have a chat about the last of the knobs of the bento box oscillator that we haven't discussed in this series yet, FM or frequency modulation. If you're enjoying this series and you want to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. Awesome way to do that. You'll be able to download all of these projects as we go along. Okay, FM stands for frequency modulation, and it's one of the two fundamental ways that we can interact with audio. Frequency and amplitude are the two fundamental things that we can modulate. And frequency modulation is a massive subject. There are so many different manifestations of it in what we hear that we can only really deal with a couple of use cases today. We'll just have a general introduction to the principles. As you can see, I've got a couple of oscillators. Only one of them's plugged up at the moment, and I've renamed them carrier and modulator. These are terms you'll become very familiar with in the FM world. The carrier is the thing that makes the sound. The modulator is the thing that alters or modulates the carrier. So what we've got here is a really simple sawtooth wave being generated by a single oscillator. Now I'm going to modulate or vary the pitch of this oscillator with my modulator. I'm going to take a sine wave output from the modulator and I'm going to plug it in to the frequency modulation input of the carrier. Two more things I need to do. I need to switch the modulator into fixed frequency mode. At the moment it's keyboard tracking. Don't want it to do that. I want it to operate as slowly as it possibly can. So it's basically going to take 7 seconds to complete a single wave. That's going to make it easy for us to track what's going on. And then finally, I'm going to introduce an amount of frequency modulation with the amount knob. And we can be very gentle with this thing. It's a very sensitive control. I'm just going to set it to 1. Now I'm going to press a note on the keyboard, which ordinarily will output a C3, 262 Hz. Let's hear what happens, and you can watch it in the tuner as well. So going up to C sharp, down to B, and back up to C sharp again over the period of 7 seconds. Probably closer to 8 actually. Anyway, 0.13 Hz, let's not split hairs. So that was frequency modulation. I modulated the frequency of the carrier with my modulator. The FM knob determines the depth of the modulation. As you just saw, we had a 1 semitone increase and a 1 semitone decrease. If I turn the FM knob up further, that's going to be a bigger sweep. It's going to take the same amount of time. We're still operating at 0.13 Hz. The modulation is just going to be deeper. Get all the way down to G sharp, and then up to a sharp E. Now if I bring that down into a little bit more sensible region again, in the ballpark of a semitone, and increase my modulation, I'm going to get a vibrato effect. This is what vibrato is. You can hear how violently that even less than a semitone is still way too much. Zero 0.1 is the smallest amount of modulation we can apply. And now we're getting somewhere in the territory. 3 to 4 Hz is typically a fairly good region to work in if you're heading for the vibrato effect. You can see it just dancing backwards and forwards in the oscilloscope. So vibrato is what you hear at very slow frequencies. Here we're basically operating as a low frequency oscillator, our modulator, cycling 3 times a second, which is really slow. If I now just give myself a little bit more modulation and start increasing the speed of this modulation, I'm going to start getting a very different effect. Around about 15 Hz, it starts becoming impossible to identify each individual oscillation, and now it just becomes an effect. If I take that way past our ability to identify individual oscillations, now it's just been reduced to a rasp, a kind of a harmonic distortion of the sound, and we can't identify the fact that the frequency is being modulated 82 times a second. It's exactly the same scientific principle that's being applied. It's just too fast for us to hear, and we hear it as a completely different effect. Right then, I'm going to take my speed right back down to the bottom again. And now I'm going to start messing with this control, this seemingly innocuous control underneath the FM dial that says EXP, that stands for exponential. You know, when I did that modulation earlier and we went up to C sharp and then down to B, that was an exponential effect. But we can make that modulation linear. If I click this button and put myself in linear mode, now when I press C, 262 Hertz, watch the upper and lower extents of the frequency ranges in the tuner. 328 down to 196, maybe 327, somewhere in that region. I'll plug those into Excel, and as you can see, our maximum frequency to within an error of 1 Hertz, which is simply measurement inaccuracy. We've gone up the same number, 65 Hertz, as we went down to get to the lower limit, basically 65, 66 Hertz. So what's happening here is that the number of Hertz, the number of cycles that we're going up and down is the same in both directions. Now that's not how harmonics work. Every time you go up 1 octave, you double the frequency. It's an exponential curve. So we've got these two different measurements to play with. Over the course of today, I'll show you why linear measurements are really important for the purpose of FM, like traditional FM tone generation. They're more important than exponential, but we'll see examples of them both. We're going to discreetly ignore this third option for the moment, probably the most important of the 3 options, but we're not going to deal with it just now. I want to go back to exponential mode. I've turned my modulator all the way down as far as I can again, and I'm going to bring the FM level up to 10 because that's a nice point for demonstration purposes. Now when I press my C, 262 Hertz, we're going to go up to A, which is 9 semitones higher, and then all the way down to D sharp, which is 9 semitones lower. There's the A, and there's D sharp. Doesn't particularly matter what that range is, it's just a good demonstration range, less than an octave, everything's nice and convenient. Now I'm going to increase the rate of modulation such that we can't identify any individual cycle anymore. 200 will take us way past anything that can possibly be identified. And so it's still doing exactly the same thing, going up to A and A3 and down to D sharp 2. It's just doing it 200 times a second. Look at the pitch we're getting out of the tuner. Despite the fact that it's confused as to whether or not it's supposed to be a D sharp or an F sharp, it's absolutely not a C. That's the one thing that we can say for certain. Furthermore, if I bring this FM knob down, you'll see the pitch change, or you'll hear the pitch change. The tuner just doesn't have a clue what's going on at this point. There, we bottomed out at C. And there you can hear the pitch going up and back down again. The reason for that is this exponential business again. Let's have a look at those numbers and get them in the book. D sharp is 156 and about 438. So 438 is 176 Hertz higher than our middle C, or C3, and 156 Hertz is just 106 Hertz lower. So we're going up further than we're coming down. We're doing that so often, 200 times a second, that our brain is being fooled into thinking that the note is actually somewhere in between that upper range and the C. Well, you heard it was either a D sharp or an F sharp, depending on what mood the tuner was in at any given moment in time. It's so difficult for it to figure this stuff out because the fundamentals have been broken. The loudest note's no longer the lowest note, the fundamental. The tuner simply can't make sense of it, but one thing it knows for damn certain, it's not a C. Well, we know it is, but of course it's been modulated so heavily, it no longer sounds like one. And this is your problem with exponential frequency modulation. The modulator changes the pitch of the carrier tone. If we apply linear frequency modulation, that's not the case. Switch back to linear again. Take this right down. Now this time I'm going to need you to ignore the tuner. Just listen to the tone. The tuner's going to get it hopelessly wrong, but listen to the tone. It's not going to go up in pitch. That's a tonal variance. Eventually, actually, there we do start going up in pitch, and then we've really broken it and we're off into wild territory. But in that early part of the range, we weren't actually changing the pitch, we were only changing the tonal quality. And now finally we can introduce the third of the frequency modulation types, what I said was probably the most important, linear through zero. The reason why I was having to be so careful with this knob and the fact that the experiment was only working in a very small range is because the linear frequency modulation is doing its job. It's increasing the frequency by a certain amount and then decreasing it by a certain amount. But eventually that modulation is going to get to the point where when it's at its lowest point, it's below zero. Well, there is no frequency modulation below zero. Zero is basically a non-moving wave. And so negative values just basically flatten out. You end up with a flat bottom on your, if you imagine a frequency modulation curve, you're just going to get these flat bottoms. That in turn is going to skew your beautiful averages. Up until that point, everything was averaging out to 262 Hertz. But now we've lost all of this data at the bottom of each of the curves when we hit zero. And so linear breaks down at some point. It's far and away the least useful of the three FM types. You could make an argument for saying you can kind of get away with just not using linear ever. Linear through zero is an enhancement and improvement of the philosophy, because now when we get down to zero, the frequency modulation has decreased the speed of the wave so far that it gets to zero. What linear through zero does is essentially it uses a fancy mechanism called wave folding to allow us to go into negative territory. It actually bounces the wave back on itself, so basically starts playing the wave backwards. And for reasons that I frankly don't understand because the maths is horrific, it allows us to go through zero and continue to maintain the average of the 262 Hertz wave. So now that I've engaged linear through zero, it doesn't matter where I turn this knob, we're always going to hear a C. The tuner might get upset occasionally, we'll see what happens, but generally speaking, it's going to work all the time. You're going to hear a C. Here we go. Excellent. Let's really push it. Yeah, I mean, eventually the tuner just breaks down. But it's quite clearly identifying a C everywhere there. So this is a big takeaway for us. If we're dealing with tonal sounds and we want to maintain a frequency-based measurement over the keys that we play, when we apply frequency modulation, we need to use linear through zero. If you use exponential mode, or in this curious hybrid case, sometimes linear mode, but primarily let's talk about exponential, you're going to get atonal results. The note that you press on the keyboard isn't going to be the pitch that comes out. Now, for the purpose of sound effects and percussion, that can be fine because those two things don't rely desperately on a tonal center. But if you're playing a keyboard as a keyboard, you're going to need to switch to linear through zero. One final piece of the puzzle we need to introduce is we need to bring key tracking back, because generally speaking, you get far more harmonious results. You're going to get a more usable frequency modulation sound if the pitch of the modulator is a multiple of the carrier, because those oscillations that the modulator is applying, they're mathematical. You know, we hear all of this stuff and we hear that harmonious relationship between the number of cycles of the modulator and the carrier. So now that I've put this in key tracking mode, this modulator is going to also, when I press that C, this is basically cycling at 262 Hertz at the moment. Let's bring our FM down into some sort of usable territory. Let's bring it up an octave. That'll work too. Everything that we've dealt with today has been used in sawtooths, but it's actually very common to have sine waves for both the modulator and the carrier, and it can produce a really nice sound. Quite quiet. Bring it back down to parity again. Good stuff. Okay, so that's a good example of linear through zero being used. Let's have a look at exponential and see a use case for it. I'm going to need an envelope, so I'll drag one in. Spent the entire demonstration with the wrong cable colours. I knew I'd go wrong at some point. Oh well. What I'm going to do is set up an envelope that has no attack, pretty fast decay, 250 milliseconds is fine, going down to a 0 sustain. So we're going to get this very sharp spike and then quickly tail away to nothing. This is going to be used as our modulation source on our carrier. And so we're in exponential mode now. Crank some of this in. So because the frequency modulator is ultimately going down to 0, the sustain level of the envelope is 0. So once it's done its thing, there's nothing else for it to do. Make that decay a bit faster. Now the amount of modulation that it's applying to the carrier is exponential, is tracking properly, or it's tracking musically. So for the lower notes, we get a much smaller modulation amount. Than we do for the higher notes. So that's a good example of exponential modulation being absolutely fine if you're either reducing to 0 by the time you've finished, by the time that envelope's finished, there's no more modulation being applied. Or as I say, in the case of percussion, where you don't have a tonal sound, it doesn't particularly matter if you detune one or two semitones, it's the effect that you're going to be going for. We're not in a position yet to build a percussion sound. We'll deal with that in one of the later episodes, but I thought that was a decent opportunity to at least illustrate an example of exponential frequency modulation. And that'll do us for today. Just saving 007 FM demo, and we can get back here when we need to. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.